Thank you all again for joining. My name is Mayra Macias. I'm the Executive Director of Latino Victory. For those of you that don't know, Latino Victory is an organization with the goal of building Latino political power. And we do that really by supporting, recruiting, and endorsing progressive Latino candidates up and down the ballot. And today's panel and conversation is one that I've been eagerly waiting for since the last debate where all three candidates were on stage. But before we begin the conversation, I do want to preface that everyone on this panel is team elect Joe Biden and now running mate Senator Kamala Harris. Yes. And with that said, just want to acknowledge that we can both be excited about electing this amazing ticket while also acknowledging that we still have a lot of work to do as a party to make sure that candidates of color, women candidates that identify with the LGBTQ community have an equal shot when they're running for office. And so today's conversation is really to have a candid discussion, both about the challenges that candidates of color and staff of color face in electoral politics, but also to propose solutions so that the next generation of presidential candidates can really learn from the lessons that these amazing trailblazing panelists have gleaned. So to kick us off, I want to make sure that we take some time and introduce our panelists. As I mentioned, they're trailblazers for many reasons. They were on the front lines working for history-making candidates, fighting for democracy, and today they're going to share with us their insight on not just how we win back the White House, but how we work to reimagine the way government and campaigns look like and how they center communities of color and underrepresented communities. So to start off, I want to introduce Roger Lau. Roger served as Senator Elizabeth Warren's 2020 campaign manager. Roger was born and raised in New York City. He started working in politics as an intern for then Massachusetts Senator John Kerry's office when he was attending the University of Massachusetts, where he studied political science. In 2012, Roger began working on Elizabeth Warren's first campaign for US Senate in Massachusetts as political director. After helping her become the first woman to serve in the Senate for Massachusetts, Roger would serve as her state director in the Senate, overseeing her staff and outreach operations in the state. He would then go on to serve as campaign manager for both her re-election in 2018 and her presidential campaign in 2020. Roger has also worked on campaigns for Hillary Clinton and several Senate and House congressional races in New England. In 2009, Roger was appointed to serve as Chief of Protocol for Commerce Department during the Obama administration. And Roger is visiting us from the Boston area, and he serves as a senior advisor to Senator Elizabeth Warren. Thank you, Roger, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Next up, we have Juan Rodriguez. Juan served as Senator Kamala Harris's campaign manager for her 2020 presidential bid. With experience as a campaign manager, policy advisor, and strategist serving leading elected officials, Juan works on a range of campaigns and strategic communications projects. As campaign manager for Kamala Harris for Senate, Juan helped lead Harris to the largest vote percentage by a non-incumbent Senate candidate in California history, carrying every demographic group, party, and region of the state. Previously, Juan was senior advisor to Attorney General Harris in the California Department of Justice, where he served as one of the Attorney General's principal advisors on issues impacting business, labor, government bodies, regulatory agencies, and community-based and nonprofit organizations throughout California and the United States. Juan was also the Director of State Relations for the City of LA under Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa. He currently serves as a partner at SCRB Strategies, where he's a general consultant for the majority of statewide elected officials in California and leading firm on policy ballot initiatives. Juan received his BA from the University of California, Los Angeles, and he earned an MBA from Pepperdine School of Business Management. Thank you, Juan, for joining from sunny LA.
Thanks for having me.
And last but not least, we saved the best for last. The only lady here, Maya Rupert, was Secretary Julian Castro's 2020 presidential campaign manager. Maya is an American political strategist, writer, and advocate. As I mentioned, she served as Secretary Julian Castro's 2020 presidential campaign manager. And might I add, that is only the third Black woman to manage a campaign. at that level. Prior to serving as campaign manager, Maya served as executive director of Castro's Political Action Committee, Opportunity First, and worked as senior policy advisor at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Maya also worked as a policy director for the Center for Reproductive Rights and the National Center for Lesbian Rights. She's also a contributing writer to a number of media outlets, including O Magazine, The Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, and The Huffington Post, where she frequently addresses the intersection of politics, race, and gender. She's been recognized by the National Association of Black Journalists for her writing and by national outlets like Ebony Magazine and The Root for her leadership in the Black community. Maya received her BA from UC Santa Barbara and her JD from UC Berkeley. She also clerked, you've done it all. She also clerked for the Honorable Eric Clay of the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Thank you so much, Maya, for being here with us.
So much, seriously, thanks for having me.
Y'all have very extensive bios, but I want to make sure to uplift that because oftentimes, you all are working to uplift your candidates and very rarely do we get to hear about the amazing work that you have done. So to kick us off, I think folks here, and again, if you have questions, feel free to add them in the chat, want to hear a little bit about what each of you have done and really what prompted you to get into politics. So I want to let's start off with you, Maya, since you were the last bio. How did you get involved in campaigns and why did you decide to take on the role of campaign manager?
Well, actually, I have a little bit of a different background sort of coming into campaigns because this is sort of my first foray into electoral politics. Like you mentioned, I trained as a lawyer and I had practiced for a while, and I saw myself sort of being drawn to the idea of politics, but truthfully, I had a very, very limited idea about what that meant. And I had a very specific, I sort of had a very specific idea of what a job in politics would entail. And honestly, I thought that it meant working for free for a number of years wasn't in the cards for me. And I think that's true for a lot of folks of color in particular. When we're looking at some of those jobs, especially sort of from our generation, it was understood that internships were going to be underpaid, that were going to be unpaid, and junior positions were going to be massively underpaid. I'm so thankful that seems like it's changing. But that really does, I think, keep a lot of folks out of some of these traditional pathways into electoral politics. So that just wasn't really my path. I was practicing when I realized that I wanted to do something that was closer to politics. I was drawn to policy work. I felt like it was sort of politics adjacent, but it was still going to be something that would allow me to work on these issues from a legal standpoint, but also to do it from like a movement with kind of a sort of a social justice movement framework, which to me was always going to be kind of my North Star, right? I wanted to be fighting for justice for our communities, and I didn't necessarily see that electoral politics was a pathway to do that. And it wasn't until I met Julian Castro when I was working for him at HUD that I first really feel like I met a politician who wanted to do what he was doing for the same reasons that I wanted to do what I was doing. And the people I sort of ran with wanted to do what they were doing, right? It was a justice framework. And he was, but he was a politician. And so once I kind of let go of the dissonance and just realize that obviously there are different paths to what we're sort of doing, I knew I was like, I can work with someone like this. So when he decided to run, I knew I was going to be with him. But truthfully, because I didn't have that background in campaigns, my first thought was not, terrific, I should be his campaign manager. But the more we kind of started building out how he wanted to run, that he wanted to run a bold and progressive campaign, that he wanted to talk about racial justice and social justice and some of the stuff that doesn't get brought up as often, and that he wanted it to be very substance-based. I felt like my background in movement politics and my background in policy work actually made a really good mix that would allow me to be helpful in that sort of in that role. So once I kind of understood the orientation of the campaign, it uniquely felt to me like, okay, this actually makes sense for me to take on this role. And I'm so grateful for it. It's been an incredible experience, but I will say that my sort of past not being in politics, it did at least initially make me wonder if this was the right role for me.
I have a quick follow-up because you were working with him while he was exploring the possibility of
yes.
running, right, leading the pack. Did you throw your name in the hat or were you already looking for campaign managers when you realized that you were the person you were looking for?
we were not only looking for campaign managers, I did the thing that I always, I talked to so many folks that like I've mentored, especially women of color, and I did the exact thing I say we should never do. And that was, he brought me up and I said, no, I'm not qualified. And so my initial reaction was, no, I think we need to find somebody who has the experience in this. You know, he was the mayor of San Antonio, but he hadn't run for anything statewide or anything at this level. So I was like, we need somebody who really has that. And so I initially tried to talk myself out of the job. Which I'm very grateful he didn't listen to me on.
And that's why I wanted to ask, because I think many of us can relate, because as you said, this isn't a path that many of us were exposed to. And I want to go to Roger next, because you actually started off interning. So contrary to Maya's path, where this was her first political foray, you've been doing this for some time. And I just want to hear how you began getting involved and what prompted you to take on this campaign manager position.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to go too far back, but, you know,
not too far. You're young, Roger.
Like this, a lot of it comes down to what motivates you, where you come from, and you know where your heart is and what drives you. And for me, it always comes back to home. You know, I was, as you mentioned, I was born and raised in New York City. You know, to two parents that were immigrants from China that both worked two jobs to make things work for me and my brothers. And you know, they made it work. They gave us opportunity, but I think I took advantage of the fact that they were out there doing what they needed to do. So I got in a lot of trouble. You know, I basically stopped going to school when I was 13 or 14. I thought I was smart. I thought I knew what I was doing, and wound up doing a lot of things that I now regret, things I'm not proud of. But what I am proud of is that eventually I picked myself back up and I made good on my promise to my mom that I would make something of myself and make that sacrifice that they made for me and for my brothers worth it. And when I talk about things I've done in the past, it's just having the opportunity to do the things that I've done and to do the things I'm doing now was just not even in the realm of possibility for me. You know, being a high school dropout, being someone, you know, who got in trouble, you know, with the police, it's just, you know, not something you can imagine. So, you know, I wound up going to University of Massachusetts, as you said, and, you know, sort of trying to find myself. You know, what I knew was I wanted to make a difference, and I didn't know exactly how or what. But I wound up getting involved in the political science class, you know, figuring out that I really, really liked the idea of learning about, you know, what it is and how our government works and how it's not working and how it could work better for people, you know, in my community and what you know, where we come from. And you know, for me, I think over the course of time, I figured out that politics is a way for us to, you know, get more people help in a broader way and get more people involved in the way that we talk about, but we didn't actually visualize. You know, I remember distinctly taking classes and, you know, talking about, you know, African Americans and white in terms of sociology, in terms of economics, in terms of, you know, what's going on in the country. And, you know, the AAPI community and the Latinx community were not even in the textbooks. And it bothered me. It got me motivated. And it's, you know, I remember asking questions about why we were not talking about or why I was not reading about our communities in the textbooks and newspapers and the studies. And they said, well, you know, there's just not enough data. And I was like, well, why is that? You know, and I think that idea of representation was something that drove me in a lot of big ways. And it wasn't just, I mean, look, at that point, I accepted I was never going to see anybody who looked like me or, you know, looked like Juan, and probably looked like Maya in a lot of different ways too, you know, not many in terms of elected officials, in terms of staff and otherwise. But I thought at the very least that what we're consuming in terms of information, what we're learning, would at least include us in some way. Because if we're not even counted, then we're not part of the conversation. So I think in a lot of ways that was what drove me to, you know, intern for John Kerry at the time. And, you know, the more I realized that, you know, campaigns make a difference because people talk to, these elected officials talk to who campaigns for them, who volunteers for them, who donates to them, who shows up to these events. And it's encouraging to see how much our world has changed. Sometimes it's frustrating to see that it hasn't changed as much as I would like it to have changed, but we've made significant strides. And I gotta say, one of the things that was most important and inspiring to me about this cycle was seeing Maya, Juan, and Adisu and others, and not just the campaign managers, but also, as we all know, all the people who are working, in all the different departments, political directors. I think all the advanced directors at one point were all women of color specifically. And, I think there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people of color who are in this cycle. And to see that and not to see us at the margins, just look outside looking in was really, really cool. But yeah, no, that's what got me in every single day. It's, there are a lot of issues I care about. Obviously, all of our bosses have talked about important issues, but what drove me every single day is I want to be in the textbook. I want our people to be represented in the data that's collected. And the only way to do that is just make the case.
Thank you, Roger. I feel like we should end it right there because that was so helpful. I'm feeling very inspired, so thank you. And thank you for sharing about your personal history and being so vulnerable. Juan, sorry you have to follow that. but something that I very much admired and we always try to uplift Juan was because Juan was the only Latino campaign manager running a presidential campaign. And for all of you, it was very clear the impact that you had on the way that the candidates and the campaigns were being run or what the candidates were talking about. So I know, Juan, that you've done a ton of campaigns and you work with everybody in California. What drove you to this work and what ultimately prompted you to take this position?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me. I love hearing Myra and Roger's story, right? And part of the reason I love hearing it is because, and I think one of my first campaigns was almost 20 years ago. I was in high school. And the thing that ultimately got me engaged in politics was really, like Roger, my parents. They were civically oriented, and they were immigrants that came to the U.S. from El Salvador during the Civil War, right? Like that story isn't really unique in California. A lot of people experience that, but they were always, we weren't rich. We struggled month to month figuring out how to kind of pay the bills like many families do now. But they were very civically activated and wanting me to be engaged and, mostly wanted me to stay out of trouble. Like a lot of my friends and that were like Roger, right? And, to me, politics was just kind of a way to engage in policy. Like Maya, I love policy. I love to kind of debate topics. I love to be a contrarian just for the purposes of engaging, thoughtful and thought-provoking ideas. And that's what it really was. And then about a decade ago, when I started working on the census, like a light bulb went. And that really was the moment where you started realizing like civic engagement matters, right? It feels like for the first time in this election, the idea that elections matter, everyone now really understands it because they learned what happened in 2016. Mm-hmm. But there's so much that happens up and down the ticket, right? Talking about policy, one of the items that, has been a big part of the debate during the primary now has been criminal justice reform. And everyone, that talks to me about that being kind of the primary issue that gets people out to vote, I ask them like, great. So what do you think about, the judicial races that are happening, this upcoming election? And more often than not, overwhelming majority of my experience has been like by the time they get to those races, they're just kind of picking by name or who they think. And it's for me has always been kind of an opportunity to engage in people, engage in debates and really try to provide a platform for people that look like us who traditionally haven't been at the table. Roger is absolutely right. The most exciting thing for me has been watching what Roger and Maya, and you mentioned Adisu, were able to do in their campaigns as well as what we were able to do, not just ensure that diversity was a priority, but ensure that people were in decision-making positions to be at the table to actually bring diversity of opinion. Because I remember one thing that Maya brought up was absolutely true. Internships seem like more like a luxury for people, right? Like my parents were like, how are you going to help, get to work to help us out? That, sometimes these aren't the type of roles that are often things that we consider in school. But, through the course of that kind of non-linear experience, politics to me was always just an opportunity to give voices to people that, traditionally didn't have a voice and didn't have an opportunity to engage in civic debate, didn't have an opportunity to, to provide or get engaged in internships. And for me, it was just an opportunity to make sure that those voices that generally aren't at the table, finally had some level of representation.
Awesome. Thank you. So all three of you worked for history-making candidates. We began this cycle, and for those of you watching that read the description, began this cycle with the most diverse slate of presidential candidates. Roger, you worked for a woman who was trying to fulfill the mandate that we did not fulfill in 2016 and be the first woman elected president. Maya, you worked for a candidate who's trying to make history for the Latinx community. Juan, you worked for a candidate who was making history as a Black woman, but also as an Asian woman. And their campaigns were so inspirational for so many of us. But we also have to acknowledge that there were a lot of hurdles that they faced that, their white male counterparts didn't. And so I want to start touching a little bit on some of that, and would love your insight, your candid insight, because I think that there's an opportunity for us to really grow and move forward. So I'll start off, Roger, if you don't mind, I'll start off with you. The senator had so many news pieces, and I personally heard so many people all over the country say, I love Elizabeth Warren, but I don't think she can win. One, did you feel like that was the biggest hurdle in your campaign? And, that from the outside looking in, that's the piece that resonated with me, that I felt was the biggest impediment to the success of the campaign, but I could be completely wrong. And if that wasn't it, what do you think were the biggest hurdles you all faced?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And it's the question that, obviously, I think all of us, over the course of the 156 or whatever days since we've been shut down at home, had plenty of time to think about. I think there are unique challenges for a lot of folks, but, what I keep on going back to at the end is that as we get closer and closer towards the end of the primary cycle, the debate stage was sort of a indication of, some of these challenges and what the debate stage looked like, because of who was on stage was said a lot. Obviously Elizabeth didn't have, a lot of the challenges that some of the other candidates had. But, I think for us, a lot of it, sure, there were questions constantly being asked whether or not the country is ready for a person of color, the country ready for a woman. But I also think that there was questions about, whether the country was ready for, candidates who talked about some, issues that, brought power to people in a more direct way. I think there were questions about whether or not a candidate can raise money and run a viable campaign by not holding fundraisers and, not prioritizing, online fundraising and, grassroots fundraising. I think electability was probably talked about more in this primary cycle than I've seen in any other campaign cycle. But at the end, I think it was a vigorous debate about, one, the importance of being Donald Trump and, who can best do that. But two, what is the best approach moving forward to galvanize the party and the ideas behind it. And I think that it was a healthy debate. I think it was healthy discussion of the entire, everyone in the primary process had. And it's been fun and interesting to see. We often joked about Friendship 2020 and how a lot of these candidates, they sparred, but they were friends before, and then in cases where they weren't, they got to know each other. And I think you've been seeing a lot of sharing of ideas. I know Elizabeth, adopted plans. She was famous for plans, but she picked up plans from people like Governor Inslee, Secretary Castro, and Senator Harris as well. So I think this discussion of ideas has been important. But I think what Elizabeth went through is probably different in some ways. I think, but there's no question that there was a lot of questions and a lot of agitations and anxiety about winning and imagining what a president looked like, and I think it's probably questions that everyone, Juan and Maya and others, had to answer very often as well.
Yeah. And speaking of collaborating, I want to go to Maya next, because after the campaign, Secretary Castro partnered up with Senator Warren and really ran a really exciting policy-driven campaign. And for full disclosure, for those of you watching, Latino Victory endorsed Secretary Julian Castro in his presidential bid as the only Latino running for president. And one of the things that I noticed in particular, because media would reach out to us and ask us all the reasons why we thought Secretary Castro would not make it. And I know that you all dealt with this on a daily basis. The man was everywhere. He was in Vegas, talking to, raising awareness on issues that hadn't been raised in a presidential cycle. And yet it felt like the coverage, the media coverage, wasn't covering that. The coverage was all of the reasons why he wasn't viable. And so I don't know if in your opinion, that was the biggest obstacle. And if so, what do you think is a lesson learned for us moving forward?
I think, I mean, that definitely was a big obstacle, and something that I sort of still sit with a lot, just to thinking about the role that the political media plays in framing the narratives and who is being thought of as sort of a genuinely viable candidate. And that was something that we struggled with early on. And I will say the endorsement from Latino Victory was huge for us, because it was sort of an early vote of confidence that, there was support and energy behind this campaign. And I don't think that Secretary Castro was unique among candidates of color being placed in this, I want to say double bind, but it's really more than that. It's like a multiple bind, where you are, as a candidate, asked to do things that are sort of fundamentally inconsistent. And each one can sort of, kind of unravel other ones. So I think candidates of color are very often asked, well, do you have your sort of base support among voters of your racial identity? And if you don't, that is looked at as, well, then you can't succeed if you can't get, your own community to vote with you. But at the same time, I remember we got so much really negative feedback, honestly, from a lot of people when we decided to have our first policy rollout be an immigration plan, because people were kind of like, wait a minute, how is the one Latino candidate going to talk first about immigration, which seems so it's like, on one hand, you're being told appeal to the folks in your community, but then when you prioritize the issues that matter to folks in your community, people say, well, wait, are you going to be able to have crossover appeal? And then there's this sense of, if there's an expectation that candidates of color are going to talk about racial justice. And we wanted to do that. That was a big piece of why he wanted to run. But at the same time, those are not issues that immediately get the media attention. They don't get covered well, honestly, when they do get covered. And so it's like, you're told you need to talk about these issues, but when those issues got brought up, you're sort of treated like you're just kind of being too niche and you're not going to have crossover appeal. It is a really, really difficult puzzle. And I think that as progressives, especially, but the Democratic Party more broadly, we are going to need to give serious thought to the really just sort of impossible dynamic that we are creating for candidates of color to be as successful. And I think that's a lot, I mean, that comes from a lot of different places, but the media is a big piece of it. The political media plays such a big role in fundraising and how voters are thinking and talking about these candidates, how polling is coming out. And it is devastating to look at the lack of diversity in a lot of the places that are sort of setting those narratives, and seeing that there are issues that are being talked about in a way that is not helpful. There are communities that are being flat out ignored, and we're not going to fix that if we don't fix it. It's exactly what we were talking about with how we're building our teams. You've got to have people in decision-making roles who can say, hold up, why are we saying this about this candidate? Why are we, why is it that we metabolize these issues so much differently when they come from a white candidate than we do when they come from a candidate of color? Are we thinking about this the best way? Are we ignoring similarities between these candidates and giving more attention here or there? And that's not going to happen if we can't really sort of, have that conversation robustly and make some changes. So I definitely don't mean it's just the media. I think there were a lot of obstacles, but that one, yes, was definitely one we kind of came to over and over again.
And I saw both Roger and Juan nodding their head vigorously when you said the impossible dynamic of the candidates and candidates of color in particular were placed under. So Juan, pivoting to your experience with Senator Harris, that impossible dynamic seems like it was a constant framing for the campaign. And the more the senator went up in polling, the more scrutiny she received and continues to receive, especially given this week's news. So one, how did you all deal with that as a campaign? And would you say this was the biggest hurdle that you all faced?
Yeah, I think it is, it definitely was a huge hurdle. And frankly, if we just look at from the moment that she was announced as the VP nominee, right? You've seen some of those lessons being magnified already, right? Let's speak some truth to power. There is some sexism that exists in body politic right now, not just coming from the right, but also that we need to deal with within the own Democratic Party. There is absolute bias. The stuff that Maya talks about is absolutely right. We try to put people into these binary categories, right? That, of course, if a person is Latino, they must speak about immigration. Turns out that, you do research and you talk to people, you just have these conversations. The things that people are worrying about, whether they are in West Virginia, in the Midwest, or California, or name your, any place in the country, are some very similar issues, right? It's like access to affordable health care. Can I get a job? Can I keep a job? Can I pay my bills? And the challenge of putting these people in these binary boxes, sometimes we fail to really identify that just the diversity in their own experience and who the profile they are is actually a value add. Roger talks about the electability framework, right? That was solely the discussion in the primary. Is this person, I may like this candidate, I really like you, and I really want to support you. I'm just not sure if you're going to be palatable in the Midwest and some of these states that we absolutely need to pick up, right? That discussion, I think all of us experience to some level. And then let's talk about the reality of what it is to be a woman running for office. And this happens at every single level. It is magnified when you look at, a woman running for president, right? It is the reality that they have to work twice as hard to just prove that, they are more than qualified, more than average. They've done a lot of work on a range of policy issues, but when you look at it in comparison sometimes to men, it is, that guy is really passionate while she's very ambitious.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And, one of the challenges that I think we have to go through is learning that we didn't learn from a lot of the mistakes that happened in 2016. In fact, we just kind of bypassed it, got excited about the diversity that we had in this embarrassment of riches that really was this primary, right? We had incredibly qualified people, and yet we're applying the same kind of sexist bias tropes that you had seen throughout and not learning from it and kind of pushing back on it. It was definitely a challenge for us. It is, frankly, a challenge that we're going to continue to face in these upcoming weeks heading to November, right? Which is why I'm so keen about talking about it and putting it out there, because, the reality is Sun really exposes some of these issues. And I think that, it's something that we continuously are going to need to kind of evolve and deal with if we're going to be able to be successful in ensuring that, we move on from some of those mistakes in the past.
Do you, and this is for any one of the panelists, do you all feel like we learned the lessons this time around? I mean, I think the biggest difference is obviously there was only one candidate in 2016 who was undergoing this scrutiny, and you all are talking about it. The candidates were very bold and spoke up, not just for them, but I remember Secretary Castro spoke up in defense of Senator Harris and some of the scrutiny she was facing. Do you all think that the message is resonating? And if not, what do we need to do, the folks watching, what do we as a collective, as a party, as a progressive movement need to do to make sure that that lesson was learned?
I'll just start really quickly. I think we're talking a little bit about it more than we have it in the past, right? I think that there are the benefit of having the Myras, the Rogers, the Mayas in these roles is because they can talk about it from firsthand experience, which I think is absolutely great. But I also think there are layers to this, right? There's a lot of disinformation happening on social media, and turns out the majority of the country doesn't live on Twitter. But it seems like we have this constant conversation happening on these social, media platforms, and we need to be able to kind of isolate what is, real versus what is not. And I think that that's kind of a burden on all of us. I think that is something that's important, but I do think that there are layers, and I think we've had some learnings, and we're talking a little bit more, but we still got a lot of work to do.
Roger, Maya, anything to add to that?
I agree with that. I mean, I think that the fact that we're having the conversation is a big plus, but then the fact that still, that we sort of saw some of these same tropes, while, Vice President Biden was making a decision around his running mate, that we still saw some of the same double standards being applied. And just honestly, the way that entire conversation evolved, that, when nominees choose running mates and the assumption is that they're going to be men, there is not this person versus this person dynamic. I don't think it was lost on anyone watching that it felt different. I mean, there was a headline, I think, from the LA Times that actually made a comparison to The Bachelor. Like, it created this dynamic of women versus women in a way that we wouldn't have seen otherwise, right? Like, I mean, we still saw some very coded, thinly veiled, both racist and sexist critiques of the women who were being evaluated. I hesitate to say that we've gotten it, because it feels like it's still happening.
Yeah, I think that's all right. I mean, I think I totally agree with Juan and Maya that the very fact that these conversations are happening, that we are reading about in the paper, and it is being acknowledged, is so important. We just got to keep on fighting, and I think a lot of it is, making sure that we're fighting together, consciously. Organizations like Latino Victory are fighting to build political power and making sure that we're fighting for representation on all levels. The fact that the three of us are sitting here with you, and it's all different backgrounds, it's women, it's a Latino man, Asian American man, talking about these issues together in unison. I think these conversations need to happen all over the place, and we need to get more people to have these conversations at as high of a level as we can on campaigns and elective office in the White House, everywhere we can. So, that's why I'm especially excited about Senator Harris being the running mate, because it gives a real opportunity for that.
Yeah.
Also, Janet, who is watching, said, "It's really inspiring to hear your stories and being raw and vulnerable with us. This is what America needs. Thank you." And something that all of you have mentioned, right, is the need to continue having these conversations. And I agree, Janet, I'm very inspired. How do we make sure that there are more Juans, more Mayas, more Rogers? What advice do you have for folks watching who maybe are not involved in electoral politics? Maybe they're community organizers. Maybe they've never thought about a political career, even a possibility. What advice do you have for them into entering this line of work?
Yeah, I'm going to piggyback off of something that Juan was saying before, and I think it's something that all three of our campaigns, and certainly other campaigns like Senator Booker's and Senator Sanders and Joe Biden's did as well. For a very long time, especially when we came up, it felt like getting involved in campaigns, getting involved in internships in government was truly a privilege. And for a long time, people used to tell me straight up, this is like a rich kid's game, right? You get to do this because you can afford to do it. And you do it until you do something else. And for the rest of us, it's taking a real sacrifice to be able to get involved in this stuff. And for many of us, through a variety of reasons, whether it's because you're a first generation American, whether it's because you're from a family that just wasn't given opportunity, many of us are the first people in our families to go to college and graduate from college, and to come out of college and at that time take a job that paid $18,000 a year. Was insane. I mean, you're basically, subsidizing the campaign at that point to do some of this work. So, I think for me, yes, part of it is we need to raise our hands and say, we want to do this, we want to make change, we want to make a difference, but also recognizing that it's not that easy, that it takes real privilege, even with the most ambition and passion and resourcefulness to be able to do this stuff. So, I think that's why, all these different campaigns for the first time you saw, we made sure that our interns were paid. We made sure that we made every effort to make sure that we're, walking the walk. And when we're talking about $15 an hour for, people that work in McDonald's or elsewhere that we're trying to do better, for our campaign staff. Because frankly, if you don't make it worthwhile, if you don't make it accessible, the campaign's going to continue to look exactly the way they do all the time. So that's one, just making sure that we're putting structures in place to make it so it's possible for our campaigns to look different and for people to be involved. The second part of it is making a real intentional effort, not only just to keep that door open, right, but like literally running outside the door and just finding people wherever you can, finding anyone who's interested in talking about it, who is even interested in exploring it, and drag them through that door, and making sure that they have the support when they get there. It takes a lot, and I think often the best thing about this cycle was that I had no role models. There was no Asian American campaign manager before me and Faz, who was Bernie Sanders' campaign manager. There was no one I could follow, and look at their model. But being able to text Maya, being able to text Juan, being able to call Adisu and to run into each other, there'd be these moments of sort of acknowledgement that we've had, backstage somewhere, and it's like, hey, how you doing? It's like, I'm good. And it's like, I know what you're going through. And it meant so much more, having that conversation with a person of color than with someone else. And knowing that they were trying to apply the same principles as they were building their teams, building out their schedules, putting out their plans, was really inspiring. So, I would say, if you're interested in doing this stuff, find what you're passionate about. All of us have different backgrounds and wind up with the same title in different organizations. But, making sure that once you're there, not only keeping that door open, but making it easier for people to come in and find them and get them in.
Wow. Roger, you need to run for office.
It really does.
This is my Latino victory plug. If you're interested in running for office, let us help you. Wow, that was very inspirational. Thank you, and thank all of you for being so intentional about building that pipeline. Maya, Juan, anything to add?
I would say, I want to give. Whenever I get asked questions like this, I think one of the responses has to be to the people making the hiring decisions, because there are things that I can encourage folks that want to get in these jobs to do, but at the end of the day, it only works if it's happening on both ends. And so if you are building teams, I would beg you to look at diverse types of experience to fill what you're trying to get done. If you say, listen, I'm trying to hire and I want to hire, people of color, I want to hire people with diverse backgrounds, but I'm looking at the pipelines and there are only a few people that have ever run a campaign at this level, so I have to choose from what I have. Take a look at what that job that you're looking for actually is. Like, management experience is very transferable. A lot of the, people don't have to have had the literal job that you're trying to fill in order to actually be able to do the job well. And I think that seeing potential, seeing that somebody has a skill set and wanting to develop is something that is very common in hiring. But for some reason, sometimes I think we look at that, we start to get a very narrow view of what makes somebody qualified. And I think we especially do that, honestly, when we're looking at candidates of color. We tend to want, I want you to have done literally this before. So I would very much encourage people who want to broaden that pipeline, broaden it yourself, because there are a lot of people who have transferable skills that can come in at senior levels in your campaign and bring a skill set that you need. And recognize that those are skill sets. If you need someone because you all don't have deep roots in X community, that is clearly an important role. So make it a senior role. Put that person in the senior level meetings. Like, you can sort of form a team that is diverse because you're valuing the skill set that people bring, as opposed to treating them sort of as the, kind of hired gun to just do one piece and then go off. So that would be my, if for folks that are hiring, please think about that. For folks that want to come into some of these roles, and I want to talk specifically with, about women and women of color in particular, because I think that there is a way that we are taught to be from a very professional young age that makes it very difficult to work in politics. And it is that we don't immediately walk into a room with a bunch of credibility, right? And so I think people learn not to raise their hands until they absolutely know the answer, and to, learn a subject matter and get it down pat, and not, to sort of want to become an expert and not trust themselves until they are. And in political jobs, in government jobs, very, very often, you are the person who is sort of the least briefed on a lot of issues. You're being the convener, right? And I do not think that we teach women to be, that is a skill set, to be the person to bring everything together, and to, sort of see the whole board. We don't tend to have an experience when we were 18-year-old interns where somebody took us to a meeting where we were too junior to be there and let us respond, let us actually say oh, this made sense, this didn't make sense. We didn't grow up professionally knowing that. And so trying to switch that gear later in life is a really difficult thing to do. So that's something that I just always try to leave, particularly with women, that no one at that table knows anything for sure. So if you're waiting until you know for sure, you're never going to raise your hand. You're never going to put your judgment in. So do it before then.
I needed to hear that today. I needed to hear that.
We still have to remind ourselves of it. I have to remind myself about that constantly still, that I'm like, wait, why am I not saying this? Is because I think it's a guess. We're all guessing. Throw it out there, and so it's a work in progress always.
Every time I need a pep talk, I call Maya.
Well, now you have this chat, Roger. This chat has turned into a Run, Roger, Run draft campaign. And there's some more questions in the Q&A that are asking what district you live in.
There's going to be a link at the end of this for Roger.
Yeah,
absolutely.
We'll start the draft campaign later.
I'll just drop the Latino victory.
Thank you. I love you guys. Yeah.
You helped build this incredible team that Senator Harris had, very diverse, lots of women in senior positions of leadership. Any insight or any advice to folks interested in jumping into this world?
Yeah, we live in it's really interesting. I love hearing both Roger and Maya kind of talk about their experience, because I think that there are some, common frames that I think a lot of us have been through. But we live in this kind of cancel type culture where everyone's trying to put this, facade of a perfect experience and bio, and, you don't experience a lot of vulnerability, right? I will be willing to sit down with anyone to talk about the races that I've lost and kind of the experience where I made mistakes. And sometimes the most challenging thing, particularly for people of color, is that because there are not a lot of people, it's hard to find a mentor. It's hard to reach out to someone to just talk about what it's like, right? And allows you to kind of explore the things that you might be interested. I think because you have people like Roger and Maya now, I think more people are breaking that ceiling. More people are actually kind of owning their power. And Maya's absolutely right. The one thing that was, for me, that I will take away from this primary cycle was not just the management aspect of it, but really the learning aspect of some of these incredibly brilliant women that I had an opportunity to work with, who are already, pundits on MSNBC as a result of this, or, in leadership positions on the Biden campaign. And Maya's absolutely right. There is a lot of talent out there. And sometimes that talent hasn't been mined because you just haven't had the opportunity to reach out. And I think for whether it's folks that are here that are interested in engaging, reach out to folks that you'd be surprised how open people sometimes are to talk about their experience or figure how to engage. For me, for the folks that I worked with on the campaign, it was a concerted effort to make sure that not only that was a standard that we were setting in terms of the ideals that we wanted for America, embedded in our campaign, but it was something that hopefully in the next cycle you saw more of. So, I kind of encourage people to the extent that they're interested in engaging in this space to reach out to people that, and they'll be surprised that I think a lot of people, and if you can't find somebody, reach out to Maya and I during our Run Roger draft.
Yes. To pivot to a more serious question that Faith asked in the chat, and I'm going to reframe this question a little bit, Faith. All of you are campaign managers of color running massive operations where inevitably things like sexism or racism come up. And I think there's some great examples of what your campaigns did when they did come up. Reframing that question a little bit, how do you intentionally build up structures to set a culture in a campaign where either if it comes up, it's addressed in a respectful way and handled, or how do we set up structures to prevent things like racism or sexism coming up, which I know is super idealistic because campaigns are a product of society and there's sexism and racism inevitably everywhere. But you know what I really valued was when things like that did come up, how your campaigns handled it. And I think a lot of that is because of you all. So if you have any insight, as we have 5 minutes left, and if one of you or two of you want to take that question.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, look, racism, sexism, discrimination happens everywhere. And I wish I could say that it didn't happen in the Democratic Party, it doesn't happen in the best of organizations, but it does. And I think that people are becoming more thoughtful, more mindful about this stuff. And you know, it's not that, part of it is I think that people are feeling empowered to be able to call it out a lot more than they used to, right? Times have changed, and you know, I think that people know that there are opportunities for people to listen. I think there are people know that there's power in community. You know, I think that what we've sort of focused on was making sure it's not just building an organization that was going to go out there every single day and say we're tolerant, we will not tolerate the stuff, or it's not okay. It's building an organization that makes people feel welcomed and part of it, and you know, feel like that they are included and empowered as a part of that inclusion, right? And you know, a lot of it was listening and learning, and I felt like I learned so much during the campaign in terms of how we treat one another. You know, some of it is definitely different from community to community, but I think a lot of it is different, you know, based on generational differences of an understanding of, you know, how people are being represented. But I think the big part of it for us is making sure that everyone knew in the organization, this is a priority for us, inclusion and representation. And it's not enough to have people in the room. It's not enough to have people seated at the table, that it's important to have people that people have chips to be able to play at the table too, right? And being thoughtful and being intentional about, you know, what it means to include someone is really important. And then, you know, when problems arise, like I said, a lot of it was listening. And then a lot of it was creating real structure that was independent to be able to address some of these concerns and making sure that there's systems of accountability in place so that, you know, people can follow up. I think every single person on the staff knew how to find me, you know, whether because they had my cell phone or my email. And I'll be honest, the vast majority of them didn't reach out, or if they reached out, it was often just a nice note. But, you know, for the rare person who did reach out to share a concern, you know, to tell me something they're angry about or upset about, I hope they felt heard, and I hope that, you know, they made a difference. But it's something that we're learning every single day.
Thank you, Roger. And we only have 3 minutes. I want to do a quick round robin. You all have been doing this for a while. You all sacrifice so much to get your candidates in the spotlight and push forward such progressive policies. What gives you hope as we head into November? And let's start with Juan, then Maya, and Roger.
You know, I think this primary did a lot to try to probably make all of us into cynics. But I'm optimistic, and I'm optimistic because, you know, if the last week is prologue to what, you know, the direction that we're headed in, I think there's a very binary decision that a lot of people are going to be making, right? Whether we pursue kind of a nationalist isolation agenda, or we actually pursue something that brings multiple people into a party because we absolutely need to. And to me, I think seeing people like this kind of come together, seeing diversity in campaigns, and just seeing a level of engagement on how little girls see themselves in, you know, in Kamala Harris or, you know, this campaign makes me really excited about the next couple of weeks. So that's what gives me hope.
Nice. Maya.
I'm feeling really hopeful because the role that activists and activism played in this cycle was huge, and something I never really thought that I would get to see so up close. I feel like so many campaigns were taking their cues, rightfully so, from folks that have been working on these issues and have been putting them front and center and seeking those kinds of like endorsements and validation the way that traditionally have only been sought of, you know, big name endorsers or, you know, folks with money, right? So I think that seeing the power that the activist community has fought for and is enjoying, and I think that will continue to enjoy, makes me feel like we're going to be on the right track.
Roger, and it might shut off, so I'm sorry.
My last thing is just I'm hopeful because several thousand young people who were involved in the primaries for different campaigns came out, became leaders, and are doing big things. And I'm counting on them.
Yay. Well, thank you all so much. We did it before it logged us out. I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for all of you who asked questions. Thank you, Roger, Maya, and Juan, and Netroots. And if any of you want to post, remember to use the hashtag #NFMoney. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
See you guys.
Bye.
Thank you.